It's 1932. The Australian military mobilizes soldiers, machine guns, and ammunition for what they believe will be a quick and easy victory. Their enemy, not a foreign army, not rebels or revolutionaries, birds. Specifically 20,000 giant flightless birds called emus. And here's the kicker: Australia lost. This is the true story of the Great Emu War, one of the most bizarre and humiliating military campaigns in human history. A conflict so ridiculous that it sounds like something out of a comedy movie, but it actually happened and the consequences were very real. But this isn't just a funny story about birds beating humans. This is a tale of ecological disaster, government incompetence, and how the Australian outback turned a routine pest control operation into an international embarrassment that's still talked about nearly a century later. Let me take you back to Western Australia in the early 1930s to understand how things got so catastrophically out of hand. The year 1932 was devastating for Australia. The country was in the grip of the Great Depression. Unemployment was skyrocketing, farms were failing, and people were struggling just to put food on the table. The government was desperate to boost the economy and had encouraged thousands of World War I veterans to take up farming in Western Australia, promising them fertile land and prosperous futures. These veterans were given plots of land in the wheat belt, an area perfect for growing crops. The government subsidized their efforts, and for a few years things looked promising. The farmers worked hard, planted vast wheat fields, and were finally starting to build sustainable livelihoods. But then came the emus. Now let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with here. Emus are Australia's largest native bird, standing up to 6 feet tall and weighing as much as 130 pounds. They're basically feathered dinosaurs with powerful legs that can run up to 30 miles per hour. And they have razor-sharp claws that can disembowel a human. These aren't cute little sparrows we're talking about. Every year, emus naturally migrated across the continent following seasonal rains and food sources. But here's what nobody anticipated. The wheat fields created by these hard-working farmers had inadvertently created a massive, irresistible buffet right in the middle of the emus' traditional migration route. In October 1932, approximately 20,000 emus descended on the farming region like a feathered tsunami, and they were hungry. These birds didn't just eat the crops. They destroyed everything. They trampled through wheat fields, demolished fences, and created massive gaps in property barriers that allowed rabbits to pour through and cause even more damage. The farmers watched helplessly as months of backbreaking work were destroyed in a matter of days. The situation was desperate. These weren't just crops being lost, these were people's entire livelihoods disappearing before their eyes. Families who had already survived the horrors of World War I and the economic devastation of the Great Depression were watching their last hope for financial stability get pecked and trampled into the dirt. The farmers tried everything they could think of. They set up scarecrows, but the emus ignored them completely. They fired shotguns into the air, but the birds would scatter temporarily and then return in even larger numbers. They tried building higher fences, but emus are surprisingly good jumpers and could easily clear most barriers. After weeks of failed attempts to control the situation, the farmers did what desperate people do. They went to the government and demanded military intervention. Now here's where things get interesting from a political perspective. The farmers were military veterans. They had fought for their country in World War I, and they had been specifically encouraged by the government to start these farms. They weren't just random citizens complaining about birds. They were war heroes being destroyed by what they saw as a winged invasion. The Minister of Defense at the time was a man named George Pierce. When presented with the farmers' request for military assistance, he saw an opportunity to accomplish two goals at once. First, he could help the farmers solve their emu problem. Second, and perhaps more importantly, he could give his troops some live-fire training exercise. You have to understand the military mindset of the era. This was just 14 years after World War I ended, and military leaders were constantly looking for ways to keep their troops sharp and their equipment tested. The idea of using emus as moving targets for machine gun practice probably seemed brilliant to them. So on November 2nd, 1932, the Australian government officially declared war on the emus. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was put in command of the operation. He was given 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis machine guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The plan was simple: locate the emu flocks, set up the machine guns, and systematically eliminate the birds. Military strategists estimated the entire operation would take a few days at most. They couldn't have been more wrong. The first problem became apparent almost immediately. Emus are incredibly intelligent and adaptable creatures. Unlike the static targets military training typically involves, these birds could think, strategize, and learn from experience. When Major Meredith and his men set up their machine guns and opened fire on the first flock of emus, something unexpected happened. Instead of panicking and scattering randomly like most animals would, the emus organized themselves. Within minutes of the first gunshots, the emus had split into small groups and scattered in different directions, making them nearly impossible to target effectively with machine guns designed for large-scale warfare. Even more remarkably, they seemed to post sentries. Individual emus would stand watch while the rest of the flock fed, and they would warn the others of approaching humans. The soldiers quickly discovered that hitting a moving emu with a machine gun was exponentially more difficult than anyone had anticipated. These birds were fast, unpredictable, and had an uncanny ability to zigzag just as the gunner was about to fire. On the first day of official combat, the military managed to kill exactly 0 emus despite firing hundreds of rounds of ammunition. But it gets worse. By the second day, word had spread among the emu population. These birds, despite having brains the size of walnuts, had somehow developed battlefield tactics. They began moving in smaller groups, approaching farms from multiple directions simultaneously, and using the terrain to their advantage. Major Meredith, a decorated military officer with years of combat experience, found himself being consistently outwitted by flightless birds. The local newspapers began covering the story, and it didn't take long for the international press to pick up on what was happening. Headlines around the world started reading things like Australian Army defeated by emus and birds outsmart military in epic battle. The government, realizing this was becoming a public relations nightmare, initially doubled down. They sent more ammunition and reinforced the operation, convinced that surely professional soldiers with modern military equipment could defeat a bunch of birds. They were wrong again. As the days turned into weeks, the Emu War became increasingly surreal. The birds seemed to learn from each encounter, developing new strategies to avoid the soldiers. Some emus began making decoy runs to draw fire, while others attacked the crops from different angles. Others learned to approach during dawn and dusk when visibility was poor. Major Meredith's field reports from this period read like something out of a dark comedy. He wrote about emus that seemed to deliberately taunt his men, coming just close enough to draw gunfire before disappearing into the bush. He described birds that appeared to communicate with each other across vast distances, coordinating attacks on multiple farms simultaneously. One particularly frustrating incident involved an emu that Major Meredith personally shot multiple times at close range. The bird absorbed the machine gun fire, stared at the Major for a moment, and then calmly walked away into the bush as if nothing had happened. Emus, it turns out, are incredibly resilient creatures. Their loose feathers and tough hide can absorb a surprising amount of damage, and unless you hit them in exactly the right spot, they can survive injuries that would kill most other animals. After several weeks of this absurdity, with ammunition running low and the emu population seemingly unaffected by the military intervention, the government was forced to make a humiliating decision. On November 8, 1932, just 6 days after it began, the Great Emu War was officially called off. The Australian military withdrew from the field, defeated by an enemy they had vastly underestimated. The final casualty count was devastating for human pride. The military had fired approximately 2,500 rounds of ammunition and had managed to kill fewer than 200 emus. That's more than 12 bullets per bird, making this one of the least cost-effective military operations in history. But the emus hadn't just survived the assault, they had thrived. The remaining 1,900 birds continued their rampage across the wheat belt, now with the added confidence of having defeated the Australian military. The story made international news, and Australia became the butt of jokes around the world. Political cartoons showed emus in military uniforms accepting the surrender of Australian soldiers. Foreign newspapers ran headlines like, "Feathered foe proves too much for Australian Army." Major Meredith, when asked by reporters about the operation, gave what has become one of the most famous military quotes in Australian history. "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks, but the story doesn't end there. The farmers were still dealing with the emu problem, and the government still needed to find a solution. What happened next is perhaps even more embarrassing than the original military failure. Instead of deploying more soldiers or trying different military tactics, the government decided to put a bounty on emu heads. They offered farmers a reward for every dead emu they could produce, essentially admitting that civilian hunters were more effective than professional soldiers. The bounty system worked. Within 6 months, local farmers and hunters had killed more emus than the military had managed in weeks of operation. The emu population was finally brought under control, not by military strategy or advanced weaponry, but by determined locals with basic hunting rifles. The Great Emu War became a defining moment in Australian culture, representing both the country's unique relationship with its harsh natural environment and the government's tendency toward bureaucratic absurdity. But there are deeper lessons in this story that go beyond the obvious comedy. First, it demonstrates the danger of underestimating your opposition. The military approached this as a simple pest control operation, failing to research or understand the enemy they were facing. They assumed that superior firepower would automatically translate to victory, without considering the intelligence, adaptability, and natural advantages of their opponents. Second, it highlights the importance of using the right tool for the job. Machine guns designed for trench warfare in World War I were completely inappropriate for hunting fast-moving birds in open terrain. The military's inflexibility in adapting their tactics to the specific challenges of the situation guaranteed their failure. Third, it shows how bureaucratic thinking can lead to absurd outcomes. The decision to use military resources for what was essentially a farming problem was driven more by political considerations and administrative convenience than by practical effectiveness. The Great Emu War also reveals something fascinating about animal intelligence and adaptation. These birds, with no formal education or military training, managed to develop effective counter-strategies against modern military equipment in a matter of days. They demonstrated problem-solving abilities, communication skills, and tactical thinking that impressed even their human opponents. Today, the Great Emu War is remembered as one of Australia's most beloved historical oddities. There are monuments, tourist attractions, and countless retellings of the story. It's become a source of national humor rather than national shame, representing the Australian ability to laugh at themselves and their government's occasional spectacular failures. But it's also a reminder that nature doesn't always behave the way humans expect it to. The Australian outback is full of creatures that have evolved to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Emus had been dealing with natural predators, extreme weather, and resource scarcity for millions of years before humans showed up with machine guns. In the end, the Great Emu War wasn't really about birds versus humans. It was about respect for the natural world, the importance of understanding your challenges before attempting to solve them, and the eternal human tendency to overestimate our own capabilities while underestimating everything else. The emus won because they were fighting on their home turf, using strategies refined over millions of years of evolution. The humans lost because they brought the wrong tools, the wrong tactics, and the wrong mindset to a problem they didn't fully understand. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that sometimes the most ridiculous stories in history contain the most important truths about human nature, government incompetence, and the humbling power of the natural world. So the next time you're facing what seems like an impossible challenge, remember the Great Emu War. Sometimes the solution isn't more firepower or more resources. Sometimes it's stepping back, understanding the real nature of the problem and approaching it with humility instead of arrogance. After all, if 20,000 birds can defeat the Australian military, imagine what they could teach us about strategy, adaptation, and the power of working together toward a common goal. The emus didn't just win a war. They taught an entire nation a lesson about respect, humility, and the importance of never underestimating your opponent, no matter how ridiculous they might seem at first glance.